Hey, everyone. I never thought I'd be here, typing this out for strangers, but honestly, I don't know who else I can talk to. My name's Blake Porter, and I've got a story I wouldn't believe myself if I hadn't lived it. I'm an architect, been doing it for almost 20 years now. My life's always been pretty solid, or at least I thought so. A good career, some decent savings, a family I'd do anything for. Sabrina, my wife, and I have been together since college. We had the whole from nothing to something story, you know? Working side by side, building up our lives together. And then there were our twin boys. They were my pride and joy. I've poured everything into giving them a good life. Things were busy, crazy busy, honestly. But I never minded the long hours. I thought it was all worth it, and Sabrina always seemed to be in my corner, supporting me, raising the boys, running our household. She was a hell of a woman, or so I thought. But I guess that's where I got it wrong. I thought we were partners, pulling together. Turns out, I was doing all the pulling and she was just biding her time. The whole thing went down at our Christmas party last year. Sabrina loves Christmas. Every December, she'd go all out, turning the house into a festive wonderland, with lights wrapped around every doorway, candles in every room, stockings, wreaths, you name it. And this time, she insisted on a big family Christmas party. I figured, why not? We hadn't hosted a big one in years, and she seemed genuinely excited. We invited our close friends, her family, including my brother, James. I didn't think twice about it. James and I hadn't always been close, but we tried to keep things civil. He's a bit of a charmer, the golden boy in the family, while I was the one with my head down, always working. I never held it against him. That's just who he is. So, yeah, I was glad he'd come, and the kids were thrilled to see him. He'd always had a way with them, showing up with gifts, playing games, doing the fun stuff while I did the heavy lifting. That night, I was busy moving from group to group, catching up with old friends, making sure everyone had drinks, all that. And Sabrina? She was floating around, laughing, chatting, mingling with everyone like she was the queen of the night. I was glad to see her having a good time. But every now and then, I'd notice her and James, just hovering around each other. Sometimes it was just a glance across the room, other times they'd disappear for a few minutes. I brushed it off. After all, they'd known each other for years, and I figured they were just talking family stuff. Then, at one point, I noticed Sabrina wasn't around. I thought maybe she was out on the patio, taking a breather. She always did that at parties, like to step outside, get a bit of fresh air when things got too loud. So I figured I'd go check on her, maybe bring her a drink, tell her how amazing she'd made everything look. I walked out to the backyard and that's when I saw them. Sabrina and James. Standing just outside the glow of the Christmas lights, like they'd purposely found a spot out of sight. They were close, talking in low voices, faces only inches apart. I remember my heart starting to race, this sinking feeling hitting me, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But then, she reached up, placed her hand on his cheek and leaned in, pressing her lips against his. They kissed, right there, without a single care in the world. My own brother. At our Christmas party. In my house. I stood there, watching, feeling like an idiot. It was as if my whole life had just shattered in one moment. They didn't even notice me at first. I could hear them laughing softly, the sound cutting through me like a knife. When I finally made a noise, a shuffling of my feet, they jerked apart, faces full of shock. Sabrina just stared at me, and for a second, I thought I saw guilt flash across her face. But it was gone as quickly as it came. I was frozen, completely speechless. Here was the woman I'd spent the last 15 years with, my wife, the mother of my kids, looking at me with this defiant expression. And James? He had that same smug look I'd seen him give 100 times before, like he'd won some private game only he knew the rules to. Care to explain? I finally managed, my voice coming out harder than I intended. Sabrina didn't flinch, though. She just crossed her arms and looked right back at me. Then, out of nowhere, she said it. The words that would haunt me for months to come. The boys already know, Blake, she said coldly, like this was just another trivial conversation. They know James is their real father. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I stood there, completely stunned, trying to make sense of what she was saying. My head was spinning. My boys? My twin sons? My entire reason for working so hard, for pushing through every long hour, every sacrifice, weren't even mine? Sabrina didn't stop there either. She went on, telling me in this detached, almost cruel tone that the boys had known for years, and that they didn't see me as their father at all. They just see you as the guy who pays the bills, she added, as if that was supposed to soften the blow. I looked at James, hoping he'd step in, maybe try to explain, or at the very least look ashamed. But he didn't. He just shrugged, like he had nothing to apologize for. In that moment, everything felt like it was crashing down. The betrayal wasn't just about Sabrina anymore. It was my own brother, my boys, my entire family life. I'd been living in this lie, and everyone around me seemed to be in on it, except me. And standing there, staring at the two of them, I knew I'd lost something I could never get back. But instead of breaking down, instead of causing a scene or getting angry, I just turned around and walked back inside. I wish I could say that the next few days were a blur, but they're burned into my memory. I went back inside that night, made my excuses to our guests, and stayed just long enough to see everyone out. Sabrina barely looked at me, and James? He had the nerve to stay until the end, making small talk with the guests like nothing happened. They both acted as if it was just another holiday, like they hadn't just ripped my world apart. When everyone finally left, the silence felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Sabrina was in the kitchen, calmly putting away dishes, her back to me, acting like we hadn't just torn open every wound a person could have. I remember standing there, watching her, waiting for her to turn around, say something, apologize, anything. But she didn't. She kept her back to me, just stacking glasses as if I wasn't even there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "How long?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. She didn't turn around. She just kept moving, like I'd asked her what she wanted for breakfast. "How long what?" she said, her voice cold and flat. "How long have you been seeing him?" I managed, though it felt like every word was ripping something inside me. At that, she finally turned. She set down the glass she was holding and looked at me with this detached, almost bored expression. "Years, Blake. A long time. I thought you might have figured it out by now." My stomach dropped. Years? I felt like I was going to be sick. All those late nights she'd said she was with friends, the trips for girls' weekends, the times I'd stayed late at work, thinking I was doing right by my family, all that time, she'd been with my own brother. I didn't want to believe it. I'd been so blind, so trusting. And the boys? I could barely get the words out. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that cut right through me. "Tell you? Blake, I didn't need to. You were always so busy with work. You never noticed what was happening right in front of you." I was quiet, just staring at her. All those years, I'd done everything I could to provide for our family, give our boys a stable life. And here she was, throwing it back in my face like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. "The boys knew," she added, as if that explained everything. "James is their real father. They've known that for a while now. You think they don't notice how absent you are? They see you as nothing more than a wallet, Blake." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "You made sure of that, didn't you?" I said quietly, the anger starting to break through. "You let them think I was just some bystander, some stranger, while my own brother played father to my kids?" Sabrina shrugged, looking almost irritated. "James was there for them. He cared about them, spent time with them. You're the one who was never around." That hit me hard. Maybe I'd been distant at times, working long hours, but I'd done it all for them. I'd thought I was making sacrifices for my family, putting in the work so Sabrina and the boys would never have to worry about anything. But according to her, that didn't count. Apparently, nothing I'd done mattered. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused. But instead, I took a deep breath and looked her dead in the eyes. "I'm done," I said, my voice low and steady. "You can have James, you can have the house, whatever you want. But don't think for a second that you're going to get away with this." She just rolled her eyes, like my words were some minor inconvenience, a mosquito buzzing in her ear. "Whatever, Blake. Do what you need to do." Just don't expect me to care. That was it. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and got in my car. I drove for hours that night, just trying to clear my head, but all I could think about was her words, the way she looked at me like I was nothing. All those years of my life spent building something I thought was real, only to find out it was a lie. By the time I got home, I had one thing on my mind: revenge. Not some impulsive, angry blow-up, but a slow, calculated payback that would make them understand exactly what they'd thrown away. Over the next few weeks, I kept my head down, moving through each day like a ghost. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see Sabrina and James in the backyard, hear her cold voice in my head, "They see you as nothing more than a wallet." Those words dug into me like barbed wire, looping through every memory I had with my sons, turning each one into something I couldn't even recognize. But instead of letting myself drown in it, I started making a plan. First, I needed information. I knew Sabrina and James had kept this affair under wraps, but there were always trails. People like them, overconfident, careless, they always slip up. I decided to start looking into every detail of our finances, our assets, all the little things I'd handed over to her to handle while I focused on work. For years, Sabrina had kept most of our household accounts in order, at her insistence. "It'll take something off your plate," she'd said once, and I'd taken her at her word. Big mistake. It didn't take long to find the cracks. I noticed expenses that didn't add up, random withdrawals, private trips I hadn't known about, and hotel charges on our joint card from dates I couldn't account for. Small charges here and there, some under fake descriptions, all adding up to a lot more than I'd realized. Sabrina had been siphoning off money for years, a little at a time. For who? Well, I think we all know. Then there were the boys' trust funds. I'd set those up when they were born, with automatic deposits to make sure they'd have something when they were older. I'd thought of it as my gift to them, my legacy. It wasn't just the money, I wanted them to feel like I'd provided for them even when I was gone. But it turned out Sabrina had been dipping into those accounts too. Transfers here and there, with no clear explanation of where the money went. I felt sick when I saw it. This was meant for my kids' future, and she'd been using it like her own personal bank. I knew right then what I had to do. This wasn't just going to be about exposing them. I was going to take everything they'd used against me, my trust, my money, my reputation, and turn it into something they could never touch again. My first step was to start moving my assets out of reach. I hired a discreet financial advisor, someone completely separate from anyone Sabrina or James would know, and set up new accounts. Quietly, without a word to her, I moved what I could into private holdings. I restructured my investments, rerouted my income into new, untouchable accounts, and got a lawyer to start drafting a trust in my name. This was going to be my own project, a foundation supporting families, marriages, real relationships. And it would all come from what Sabrina and James had thought they could take from me. I even redirected the boys' trust funds. I set up new accounts under the foundation's name, earmarked for projects that would help families and kids struggling with broken homes. I knew they'd probably hate me for it. But if they only saw me as a wallet, then that wallet was going to have its own purpose. They could learn to respect that, or they could go to James if they wanted something else. Every move I made was quiet, careful. I didn't let on to anyone, least of all Sabrina. I let her go on thinking she'd gotten away with it, that I was still the same clueless, overworked husband she'd been fooling for years. She had no idea. And the best part? I started seeing subtle changes around the house, little things she'd left out or forgotten to hide. Maybe she thought I was too broken to notice, or maybe she was just getting sloppy. But I noticed. I saw the private phone calls, the way she'd go quiet when I walked into a room, the late nights she'd started taking for herself. She thought she had me. But I was just getting started. I kept things going like this, letting Sabrina think I hadn't changed a thing. I'd go to work, come home, and act like I was just going through the motions. I'd ask her the usual questions, how her day was, what the boys were up to. And she'd answer in that flat, uninterested way, like she was barely tolerating me. If anything, my quiet demeanor seemed to give her more confidence, as if she thought I was too beaten down to fight back. Meanwhile, I started digging into James. He and I weren't exactly close, But as my brother, he'd been around for all the important stuff: birthdays, holidays, dinners. He knew my family well enough to act like he was part of it, even though he never really contributed. I'd always brushed off his arrogance, thinking it was just part of his charm. But now I was seeing it all in a new light. And I realized something. If Sabrina had been keeping me in the dark, she'd probably been hiding things from James too. So I made a few calls, starting with a couple of old friends who had connections in James's industry. I didn't tell them much, just that I wanted a little background on his finances and projects. Within a week, I started to see the real picture. James had his own struggles: debts, failed investments, sketchy deals that had drained his accounts. On the surface, he looked like he was doing fine, but he was drowning in debt. And I'll admit, knowing that was like finding a lifeline. Here was a man who thought he could take everything from me, who'd betrayed me, who'd thought he was untouchable. But he was living on borrowed time. I kept my discoveries to myself, playing the part of the oblivious husband and brother. But in the evenings, I'd start looking into every legal loophole, every option I had to make sure they'd feel the consequences of what they'd done. I found that James had been dipping into Sabrina's fund, the money she'd pulled out of our accounts for years. Turns out, it wasn't just for fancy hotels and weekends away. She'd been using it to prop him up, probably thinking she was saving him or buying his affection. The irony was rich. Here was James, who saw me as nothing more than a boring workaholic, leeching off my money without even knowing it. And Sabrina? Well, she probably thought she was some sort of savior, helping James rebuild his life while I toiled away to keep it all running. Once I had enough evidence, I set up a meeting with my lawyer. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and he helped me map it out perfectly. Together, we drafted papers that would start transferring assets into a trust, with specific clauses ensuring that none of it could ever be touched by Sabrina or James. I included provisions for the boys, of course, but even those funds would go into the foundation I was building. I wanted to make it clear that I hadn't left them with nothing. I just left them with something they'd have to earn. By the end of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. For the first time since this nightmare started, I was holding the reins. I'd spent years letting my family, my finances, my entire life be controlled by other people's expectations, but that was over. I wasn't going to sit by while they turned me into a joke. Over the next few days, I started noticing more changes. Sabrina would get phone calls late at night, which she'd take in another room, her voice low and tense. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with this strange expression, like she was trying to gauge what I was thinking. Maybe she sensed something, or maybe she was just paranoid. Either way, I stayed calm, kept my tone casual, let her think she was still in charge. The breaking point came one evening when I got home a bit earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the boys out with friends. I found Sabrina sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and she didn't even look up when I walked in. But I noticed she was tense, her grip on the phone a little too tight. I took a seat across from her, folding my hands calmly. "So, anything new with James lately?" She froze, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. There was a split second of panic before she recovered, giving me this fake, dismissive smile. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "Just wondering if he's been in touch. You two seem to talk a lot these days." Her face went blank, her usual mask slipping just a bit. "We're just friends, Blake. You know that." "Friends," I repeated, holding her gaze. "Is that what he told you?" She blinked, clearly thrown off. For the first time, I could see doubt creeping into her expression, like she was starting to realize this wasn't going to go the way she thought. I didn't say anything more. I wanted to let her stew in it, to make her wonder just how much I knew. And judging by the look in her eyes, it was working. After that night, I noticed Sabrina started acting different, more cautious, almost skittish. She'd glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes sharp and calculating, like she was trying to figure out just how much I knew. And every time I caught her, I'd just smile, a quiet, knowing smile that I could tell rattled her. I wanted her to feel it. To feel every bit of the doubt, the insecurity, the confusion that she'd dumped on me all these years. I kept up the act, going to work, keeping our routine as steady as ever. But underneath it all, I was setting up everything I needed to turn this entire situation on its head. I'd already rerouted the boys' trust funds and set up the foundation. Now it was time to get Sabrina and James to trip over themselves. To do that, I needed to stir the pot a little. I knew James would fall for the bait. He always had an ego, a weak spot for anything that made him feel powerful. So I reached out to him. Nothing big, just a quick text. "Hey, it's been a while. Let's catch up sometime." It took him a few hours to reply. I could picture him reading it, trying to figure out my angle. Finally, he sent back a quick, "Sure, sounds good." A few days later, we met up for drinks at a bar downtown. He looked nervous, his confident swagger dialed down to something more cautious. It was satisfying to see him like that, like he was waiting for me to say something he couldn't handle. But I kept it friendly, asked him how things were going, acted like I hadn't noticed a thing. And the more relaxed I seemed, the more he started slipping back into his usual self, leaning back with that smirk, acting like he owned the place. Eventually, he started talking about his projects, the same ones I knew were barely keeping him afloat. He bragged a little too much, talked about some big opportunities coming up, and made a point to say he was looking after Sabrina and the boys. My stomach tightened at that, but I kept my face neutral, nodding like I was impressed. Then casually I threw it out there. "You know, I've been meaning to go over our family finances with Sabrina, just to make sure everything's on track." James went still for a second, then gave me a quick smile. "That's a good idea. You can never be too careful, right?" "Right?" I said, letting the word hang in the air. "Especially with everything that's been going on. Wouldn't want any surprises." I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, just for a split second, before he covered it up with a forced laugh. He picked up his drink, looking away like he was trying to shrug it off. But I knew that line had landed exactly where I wanted it to. A few days after that, Sabrina started bringing up little things, almost like she was trying to get a read on me. She'd ask if I was happy with the boys' school, or if I'd thought about moving to a different neighborhood, all casual questions that felt anything but casual. It was clear she was fishing, trying to gauge where I stood, but I didn't give her anything. I just smiled, nodded, agreed with whatever she said. I could see it driving her nuts, which was exactly what I wanted. Then, one evening, I left my laptop open on the kitchen counter, with my emails pulled up. I'd purposely left an email open, one from my lawyer with the subject line, "Trust Fund Revisions, Confidential." It was bold and hard to miss, right at the top. I made sure Sabrina was nearby, busying myself in the other room but keeping one eye on her. I watched as she glanced at the laptop, hesitated, then leaned in a little closer to read the subject line. I could see her jaw tighten, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She had no idea what was in that email, but she knew enough to be worried. "Something wrong?" I asked, walking back into the kitchen and glancing casually at my screen, as if I'd forgotten it was open. She straightened up immediately, forcing a smile. "No, just wondering what you were working on." I shrugged, closing the laptop. "Just some financial stuff for the boys. Making sure they're set up for the future." She nodded, trying to hide the tension in her eyes. "Good idea," she said, her voice a little too casual. "They'll need it." "Exactly," I replied, my tone light but firm. "And I'm making sure no one else will ever touch what's theirs." Her face paled slightly, and she glanced away, pretending to busy herself with a dish in the sink. I could see the wheels turning in her head, could practically feel her starting to realize that things weren't as under her control as she'd thought. And just like that, I knew the trap was set. She was going to dig herself deeper, trying to figure out what I knew, trying to get one step ahead. But every step she took, every little move she made, was going to lead her exactly where I wanted. I was done being blindsided. From here on out, I was the one calling the shots. After that night, Sabrina seemed to spiral a little more each day. She started spending even more time on her phone, sending texts late at night, stepping out to take calls where she thought I wouldn't hear. I noticed her whispering, her voice low and tense, and every time I caught her, she'd glance over her shoulder like a guilty teenager. It was strange to see. This woman I'd once thought was so in control, so polished, slowly unraveling in front of me. I made a point to ignore it, acting like I didn't notice a thing. And the more I pretended, the more reckless she got. I'd catch her slipping money from her own accounts, small amounts at first, then bigger ones, funneling them to who knows where. It was almost like she was preparing for something, maybe even for the fallout she thought was coming. But the truth was, she had no idea what I was setting up. One afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. He told me the trust was fully established, every document signed and sealed. All my assets were now tied up in it, with very specific rules about how and when those funds could be accessed. Sabrina and James were officially cut off, with no direct access to a single cent. From the outside, it looked like my assets were exactly where they'd always been, but in reality, I'd pulled everything out of their reach. And they wouldn't even realize it until it was too late. My next step was subtle but important. I had to plant one final seed, something that would push Sabrina and James over the edge. So, I arranged a business trip. I packed a bag, left a note on the counter saying I'd be gone for a few days, and drove out of town. But instead of actually leaving, I parked in a nearby lot and rented a cheap motel room a few miles away. Then I waited. It didn't take long. By the next evening, Sabrina had apparently decided that my absence was the perfect opportunity. I had installed a camera in the living room weeks ago, tucked into a corner where she'd never see it. I checked the feed and sure enough, there she was, letting James into our house like he belonged there. They didn't waste any time. Within minutes, they were on the couch, whispering and laughing like this was some kind of romantic getaway. As I watched, my chest tightened. This wasn't a new kind of pain, but it was sharper, cutting deeper because I could finally see it for what it was. They were so comfortable, so casual about it. They sat there, flipping through our family photo albums on the coffee table, laughing at pictures of the boys, as if none of this would ever come back to haunt them. I recorded everything, making sure I had proof. And then, just when I thought they couldn't sink any lower, I saw Sabrina lean in, whisper something to James that made him laugh out loud. I didn't have to hear the words to know it was about me. The smugness on his face, the way he looked around my house as if it was already his, told me everything I needed to know. When I finally turned off the feed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I'd seen enough. I didn't need any more proof, any more reminders. I had everything I needed to finish this. The next morning, I drove back to the house, my trip conveniently cut short. Sabrina was still asleep, and I could tell from the disarray in the living room that she hadn't even bothered to hide her little get-together with James. Empty wine glasses, a few crumpled napkins, they'd left the place looking like a couple of teenagers sneaking around behind their parents' backs. I decided it was time to give her a taste of what was coming. After breakfast, I casually mentioned to Sabrina that I'd been thinking about our finances and wanted to set up a meeting with our accountant. She looked up, her face suddenly tense, her fork hovering over her plate. "Why would we need to do that?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Oh, just to make sure everything's in order," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "After all, if something were to happen to me, I'd want to make sure everything's set up for you and the boys." Her face went pale, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. She forced a smile, nodding, but I could tell she was barely holding it together. "Of course," she said, her voice strained. "That makes sense." I smiled back, keeping my expression calm. "Good. I'll set something up for later this week." I could see her discomfort growing, her fingers clenching and unclenching around her coffee mug. She was in deep now, and she knew it. She didn't know how much I knew, but she could sense that the ground beneath her was shifting. And the best part? She was too afraid to ask questions. That was all I needed. I'd set everything in motion, and now, it was only a matter of time before Sabrina and James realized just how thoroughly I'd cut them out of my life. They thought they'd been the ones in control, but they were wrong. The final act was coming, and they had no idea that the rug was about to be pulled out from under them. After that conversation, Sabrina was on edge, watching me carefully but trying to act like everything was normal. She'd start to say something, then stop herself, her lips pressing together like she was afraid of what might slip out. I could tell she was torn between wanting to know what I was planning and being terrified of what she might hear. And honestly, that was exactly where I wanted her. A few days later, we had the meeting with our accountant. I'd set it up to look routine, just the usual yearly financial review. Sabrina sat next to me, hands folded in her lap, looking a little too stiff, a little too eager to pretend she knew what was going on. And the accountant? He played his part perfectly, running through our assets, explaining how we'd restructured some things to maximize future returns. He didn't mention the trust fund or the foundation I'd set up. No, that was my little secret. Instead, he talked about long-term security and safeguards for the family. Sabrina kept nodding along, but I saw her eyes flicker over to me more than once, the hint of fear in her gaze unmistakable. After the meeting, we walked to the car in silence. Sabrina looked like she wanted to say something, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to keep her calm. Finally, when we were halfway home, she broke the silence. So, all that stuff he mentioned, the changes you made to our accounts. Why didn't you tell me about it? Her voice was careful, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I shrugged, keeping my tone light. I didn't think it would matter. Just making sure everything's secure for the boy's future. You don't have to worry about a thing. Her jaw tightened, but she forced a smile, nodding as if she believed me. Well, I appreciate it. It's just, a little surprising. I smiled back. Glad you understand. We both want the best for them, right? The rest of the drive was silent, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee, her gaze fixed out the window. She didn't press any further, and I could tell she was rattled, unsure of what I knew or what I'd done. But she was smart enough to know something was happening, even if she didn't know what. And that was exactly what I wanted her to feel, a slow, creeping doubt that would keep her on her toes, keep her guessing. Then I decided it was time to set the next phase into motion. I scheduled a family dinner, inviting her parents, my parents, and a few close family friends. Sabrina looked surprised when I told her, but she didn't argue. She probably thought it was my attempt to put on a good front, to pretend that everything was normal. But I had a very different reason for getting everyone together. On the day of the dinner, I made sure everything was perfect. I grilled steaks, set out my best wine, and made the place look as welcoming as possible. Sabrina played the perfect hostess, smiling and laughing with everyone, trying to project this image of the devoted wife and mother. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting over to me, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And drop it did. Midway through the dinner, just as everyone was settling in, I raised my glass for a toast. To family, I said, keeping my voice steady. And to the truth. A few people looked confused, glancing at each other, but Sabrina just froze, her smile faltering as her gaze locked onto mine. Blake, she murmured, a warning in her tone. But I wasn't about to stop. I'd planned this moment too carefully. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes before finally settling back on her. Sabrina, I said, my tone calm, almost gentle, how long were you planning on keeping it a secret? She stiffened, her eyes widening, and for a split second she looked terrified. But then, like the practiced liar she was, she managed to recover, forcing a laugh. I don't know what you're talking about, Blake. Oh, I think you do, I replied, setting my glass down. You and James. How long has it been? The silence that followed was absolute. Her parents stared at her, mouths open in shock, while my parents looked at me, a mixture of horror and disbelief on their faces. No one moved, no one spoke, everyone just sat there, frozen in the fallout. Finally, one of her friends, who'd clearly caught on, whispered, Sabrina, is this true? Sabrina's face went pale, her hands trembling as she glanced around the table, trying to find an escape. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. She'd built her lies so carefully, convinced herself she'd gotten away with it, but now it was all crashing down around her, right in front of the people she'd tried so hard to deceive. Blake, she stammered, her voice cracking. But there was no sympathy in my eyes, no mercy left. I wanted her to feel every ounce of humiliation, every bit of shame, the way I'd felt it when I'd first discovered the truth. Go on, Sabrina, I said quietly. Tell them. Or would you prefer I do it? She swallowed, her gaze falling to her lap as she shook her head, defeated. Fine, she whispered, barely audible. It's true. James and we've been together. The room erupted. Her mother gasped, her father's face turned red with anger, and my parents looked crushed, their eyes filled with a sadness I'd never seen before. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She was finally exposed, and there was no going back. She'd lost everything, her reputation, her friends, her family. And she had no one to blame but herself. As everyone else started to gather their things and leave, whispering in hushed voices, I stayed where I was, watching her. She sat alone at the table, her head in her hands, the perfect picture of defeat. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word, and I didn't bother offering her any comfort. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. The next morning, the house felt hollow, like the walls themselves were carrying the weight of what had happened the night before. Sabrina didn't come down for breakfast. I could hear her moving around upstairs, probably pacing, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of her world. But I wasn't planning on making it easy for her. Around mid-morning, I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and hesitant. She walked into the kitchen, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red like she hadn't slept at all. She sat down across from me, staring at her hands, the silence thick between us. "Blake," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I messed up. I know what I did was unforgivable. But can we talk about this?" I looked at her, my expression as unreadable as I could make it. "Talk about what, Sabrina? The fact that you lied to me for years? The fact that you let my brother into our lives, our home? Or maybe the fact that you turned my sons against me?" I could hear the bitterness in my own voice, but I didn't care. She deserved to hear every ounce of it. She flinched, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. "I know," she whispered. "I know I hurt you. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But the boys, they're still your sons, Blake. They still need you." I let out a bitter laugh. "They need me? Sabrina, you made sure they'd never see me as anything more than a paycheck? You and James saw to that." She looked away, guilt etched into every line on her face. For once, she didn't have a retort, no clever lie to throw back at me. She just sat there, defeated, as if she finally understood that she'd crossed a line she could never come back from. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened." I shook my head, disgusted by her choice of words. "No, Sabrina. Affairs don't just happen. You made choices every step of the way. And those choices have consequences." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, her hand hovering just inches from mine. "Blake, please. We can work through this. We have history, a life together. Don't throw it all away." I pulled my hand back, refusing to let her touch me. "No, Sabrina. You threw it away the minute you brought James into our lives." I took a steadying breath, pushing back the last remnants of anger that tried to rise up. "I'm done. I've been done for a while." The finality of my words seemed to hit her hard. She closed her eyes, the tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded slowly, accepting the reality she'd tried so hard to avoid. "So, that's it then?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "That's it," I replied, standing up from the table. "I'll be moving forward with the divorce. You'll get the papers soon." She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just sat there, broken, as I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the mess she'd made. Over the next week, I set everything into motion. My lawyer drew up the paperwork, outlining a clean split of our remaining assets and custody arrangements for the boys. But thanks to the foundation and the trust I'd established, there wasn't much left for Sabrina to claim. I made sure she'd get enough to get by, but not enough to live the life she'd grown accustomed to. She'd have to work for that just like the rest of us. When she finally received the papers, she came to me, clutching the envelope with a desperate look on her face. "Blake," she started, her voice shaking. This isn't fair. You can't just cut me out like this." I raised an eyebrow, barely able to contain my disbelief. "Fair? Sabrina, you think I owe you fair? After everything you did?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly at a loss for words. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought I'd be able to turn the tables so completely. I could see the shock, the anger, the helplessness in her eyes, and for once, I didn't feel even a shred of sympathy. You'll be fine, Sabrina, I said calmly, taking the papers from her and tucking them back into the envelope. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. She took a shaky breath, trying to regain some control. But the boys, Blake, they're used to a certain lifestyle. They won't understand why things are changing. I shook my head, cutting her off. You can explain it to them. Tell them why things are different now. Tell them who really broke this family. I watched as she stood there, struggling to keep her composure, her face a mixture of anger and regret. But she didn't have anything left to say, no more lies, no more excuses. For the first time in years, she was speechless. And it was exactly where I wanted her. In the following months, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects, expanding my firm, and getting involved with the foundation I'd created. It became more than just a way to secure my assets. It was a way to give back, to put my time and energy into something that would actually make a difference. And gradually, the weight of betrayal began to lift. I started to feel lighter, freer, as I let go of the bitterness that had consumed me. My revenge wasn't about tearing Sabrina and James down anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could rebuild, that I could take the worst thing that had happened to me and turn it into something meaningful. My sons, though? That was still complicated. They were angry, confused, maybe even a little resentful. Sabrina had spent years painting me as a distant father, that's paycheck dads who didn't understand them. And now, they were struggling to see me in a different light. But I was determined to try. I started reaching out to them, showing up at their games, inviting them to spend weekends with me. It was slow work and some days it felt like I was hitting a wall. But little by little, I could see their defenses starting to crumble. The boys were hesitant at first, guarded in a way that made my heart ache. They weren't little kids anymore. They were teenagers, with opinions and anger that ran deep. I could see the resentment in their eyes, this idea they'd been fed that I'd somehow abandoned them, that I'd never been there, that I'd only cared about work. And no matter how much I wanted to shake that out of them, I knew I had to be patient. They'd been hurt too, manipulated in ways they didn't even understand yet. The first weekend they spent with me was rough. They barely spoke to me, answering in grunts or one-word replies, their eyes always flicking toward their phones or the door like they were waiting for an escape. I'd try to ask them about school, their friends, the sports they played, but they'd shrug or give me vague answers, making it clear they were just counting down the hours until they could leave. That Saturday night, after a quiet, awkward dinner, I finally decided to address it head-on. I put down my fork and looked at them, waiting until they met my gaze. Look, I began, choosing my words carefully. I know you're angry. And I know you probably think I'm the bad guy here. I want to hear what you're feeling. Whatever you have to say, just say it. They exchanged a glance, their faces uncertain, as if they didn't quite believe I meant it. Finally, one of them, Ethan, the more outspoken of the two, spoke up, his tone sharp. Why should we? You're never around anyway, he muttered, his voice barely masking the anger underneath. I took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I get it. I wasn't around as much as I should have been. I was working a lot, trying to provide, trying to give you guys a good life. But that doesn't excuse it. And I'm sorry if that made you feel like you didn't have a dad. Ethan looked away, his jaw clenched. My other son, Lucas, was quieter, more reserved, his eyes downcast as he picked at the edge of his plate. I could tell he wasn't ready to open up, but I could feel the hurt radiating off him. You didn't even care about us, Ethan said, his voice cracking a little. You were just the guy who paid for stuff. That's it. Mom and Uncle James, they were the ones who were actually there. Hearing them refer to my brother as Uncle James stung, but I kept my face steady, my voice calm. I get why it feels that way. But that's not the truth, and I hope that one day you'll see that. Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms. Why should we believe you? Mom said, she said you didn't even want to be around us. That you cared more about your job than about us. I clenched my fists under the table, the frustration bubbling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. Your mom and I, we had our issues. But don't ever think for a second that I didn't want to be with you. You're my sons. You've always meant everything to me. I didn't realize how much I was missing until it was too late. They were quiet after that, processing my words in their own way. I could tell they still didn't fully believe me, that Sabrina's influence had dug deep. But I also saw a flicker of doubt, a hint of curiosity that told me maybe, just maybe, they were willing to give me a chance. Over the next few months, I made it my mission to prove to them that I wasn't just a paycheck dad. I went to their games, showed up at their school events, and invited them over as often as I could. I didn't push them to talk, didn't try to force any big, emotional conversations. I just showed up, consistently, again and again, hoping that would be enough to start breaking down the walls Sabrina had built between us. And slowly it started working. They'd come over and actually talk to me about their lives. Little things, like a new video game they were playing or a class project they were working on. They'd let their guard down, just a bit, like they were testing the waters to see if I was really going to stick around. And every time they did, I made sure I was there, ready to listen, ready to be whatever they needed me to be. One night, Lucas stayed back after Ethan left, saying he had a project to work on and that it'd be easier to do it at my place. I knew it was just an excuse, but I didn't call him out on it. Instead, I sat with him in the living room, just the two of us, the silence comfortable for the first time in a long time. After a while, he looked over at me, his face serious. "Dad, did you and Mom really hate each other?" I paused, not sure how to answer. "It's complicated, Lucas. Your mom and I, we had a lot of problems. But we loved you and your brother more than anything. That was never fake." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Mom made it sound like you just didn't want us." My heart clenched. I could hear the hurt in his voice, this raw pain he'd probably been carrying for years. "I'm sorry if that's what it felt like," I said, my voice thick. "But it's not true. I've always wanted you and Ethan in my life. I made mistakes. And I'll spend the rest of my life making up for them if I have to." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and after a moment, he nodded, like he finally believed me. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet. But it was a start, and I'd take it. As things started to improve with the boys, Sabrina's life was heading in the opposite direction. She'd lost the respect of her friends and family after the truth came out, and her financial situation was even worse. Without access to my income, she couldn't keep up with the lifestyle she'd gotten used to. I knew from mutual contacts that James was barely holding things together, scrambling to make ends meet and dealing with his own fallout from our family's disgust. One evening, Sabrina showed up at my door. She looked worn, tired, a shadow of the person she'd once been. She glanced at me, her eyes pleading. "Blake, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "Things have gotten out of hand. I can't keep up. The boys, they deserve better than this." I looked at her, feeling the weight of everything she'd put me through, all the lies, the betrayal. But I kept my face neutral, my voice steady. "You made your choice, Sabrina," I said quietly. "You wanted to tear down everything we built, to replace me with James, to lie to our kids. And now you're facing the consequences." She looked away, her shoulders slumping, defeated. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I'm asking for the boys. They need stability." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I'll always make sure the boys are taken care of. But that's where my help ends. You and James made your bed. Now you'll have to lie in it." She didn't argue, didn't plead further. She just nodded, a broken shell of the woman who'd once looked at me with contempt. And as she walked away, I felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a strange sense of closure, like I'd finally closed a door I'd been holding open for far too long. My focus now was on the future, on the foundation I'd built, on my sons, and on the life I was slowly rebuilding. I couldn't erase the past, but I could make sure it didn't define me. And as I watched Sabrina walk down the driveway, fading into the night, I knew I was finally free. So here I am, months after everything went down, sitting in a quiet house, writing this out for anyone who might find themselves in a place like mine. If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said betrayal was something that happened to other people, something I'd only heard about in stories. I'd spent years building a life, a career, a family, convinced that I was doing everything right. Turns out, life doesn't care much about our plans. Looking back, I realize now that the betrayal wasn't just a one-time event. It was a long, gradual rot, chipping away at things I thought were solid. Sabrina didn't just betray me by having an affair. She betrayed everything I'd thought we were building together, all the years, all the memories, all the trust. And my brother, James, well, he was more than just a sibling. He was someone I'd grown up with, someone I thought I'd always be able to count on. That's the part that still cuts the deepest even now. But here's what I've come to understand. Betrayal is powerful, yes, but it doesn't have to define you. It can tear you down if you let it, or it can be a strange kind of fuel, a wake-up call to see things for what they really are, not what you wish they could be. I spent so many years doing what I thought was best for my family, believing that if I worked hard enough, provided enough, sacrificed enough, I'd be building something lasting. But real relationships aren't built on what you can give, they're built on trust and respect. And that's something that, in the end, neither Sabrina nor James was capable of offering. I could have gone down a darker path with my revenge. Believe me, I thought about it more than once. But I realized that holding on to that anger, letting it consume me, wouldn't bring me any real peace. Instead, I decided to invest my energy in building a foundation that could help others who've been through the same kind of betrayal, families who need real support, real hope. That's something I can be proud of, something that can actually make a difference. My boys? That's a work in progress. I've learned that repairing relationships, especially with kids who've been caught in the middle, takes time and patience. I don't expect them to forgive me overnight or to understand the whole truth just yet. But I'm here for them every day, in every way I can be. And maybe as they grow older, they'll see that I never stopped trying to be the father they deserve. Maybe they'll come to understand that love isn't about the perfect image Sabrina tried to sell them. It's about showing up again and again, even when things are hard. As for Sabrina, I'm done carrying the weight of what she did. She has to live with the choices she made, with the life she tore apart. The house we once shared is empty now, filled only with the echoes of what could have been. But I don't regret letting her go. I don't regret stepping away from something so toxic, even if it means starting over. I'd rather rebuild on my own than live a life full of lies. In the end, what I've learned is this: we don't always get the life we expect, but we always have the choice to decide what we do with the life we have. I didn't ask for any of this, but I chose to turn it into something new, something worthwhile. Maybe it's not the story I would have written for myself, but it's one I can live with. And that, I think, is enough.